Jawaharlal Nehru, Architect of Modern India. Part 1. The Roots of a Revolutionary. Early Life and Education. Jawaharlal Nehru, born on 14 November 1889 in the city of Allahabad, British India, would grow into a statesman, philosopher, and freedom fighter whose leadership would shape the destiny of an emerging nation. As the first Prime Minister of independent India, Nehru's legacy was immense, but the foundation of his life was laid in the early years under the influence of privilege, cosmopolitan education, and a deepening awareness of colonial injustice. He was born into the illustrious Nehru family, part of the Kashmiri Pandit community Brahmins who had migrated from the Kashmir Valley to the northern plains. His father, Motilal Nehru, was a wealthy and influential barrister with a growing presence in the Indian National Congress, the foremost political platform for Indians seeking greater autonomy from British colonial rule. His mother, Swarup Rani, came from a similar background of affluence and cultural refinement. Jawaharlal was their first child, followed by two sisters, Vijaya Lakshmi, who would later become a prominent diplomat and the first female president of the United Nations General Assembly, and Krishna Huthay Singh, who became a notable author and chronicler of the Nehru family. The Nehrus lived in Anand Bhavan, a sprawling mansion that served both as a home and, eventually, as a political hub for nationalist activity. Jawaharlal's early life was shaped by this environment of intellectual energy and upper-class comfort. His education began at home, under private tutors and governesses. Among them was an Irish tutor, Ferdinand T. Brooks, whose theosophical leanings introduced the young Nehru to a world of spiritual inquiry and introspection. At the age of 13, Nehru joined the Theosophical Society under the guidance of Annie Besant, a British woman who had become a fiery Indian nationalist. While Nehru's interest in theosophy was short-lived, it kindled a lifelong passion for India's philosophical traditions and ignited his curiosity about religion, ethics, and the meaning of civilization. Even as a child, Nehru was precociously observant. He was aware of his family's special status and the disparities between their life and that of the common Indian. Yet, growing up in an insulated environment, his sense of India as a colonized nation was initially abstract. That began to change as he matured. International developments, particularly in Asia and Africa, began to influence his thinking. The victory of Japan over Russia in the 1945 Russo-Japanese War left a profound impact on the teenage Nehru. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had decisively defeated a European power. For Nehru, this victory represented a crack in the myth of European invincibility and stoked his dreams of Indian liberation. In 1905, Nehru was sent to England to attend Harrow School, one of Britain's most prestigious institutions. There, he was nicknamed Joe Nehru by classmates and found himself navigating the elite corridors of imperial power while mentally wrestling with the reality of India's subjugation under the British Raj. He was exposed to British culture, history, and literature, but it was political philosophy that began to attract him most. After Harrow, he entered Trinity College, Cambridge in 1907, where he read natural sciences. Though his degree was in science, his passion lay in the humanities, particularly in history, economics, politics, and literature. He read voraciously. The works of authors like Bernard Shaw, Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells, and John Maynard Keynes deeply influenced his outlook. These writers, proponents of socialism, liberalism, and rational thought, helped Nehru craft a worldview that was modern, progressive, and socially conscious. Graduating in 1910, Nehru next proceeded to study law at the Inner Temple in London. He qualified as a barrister in 1912, completing the path that many in the colonial elite followed, but his heart was not in law. His London years were transformative for other reasons. He had become aware of the Fabian Society, a British socialist group advocating gradual reforms over violent revolution. He admired the writings of Beatrice and Sidney Webb, founders of the society, and came to believe in the potential of state-planned development and equitable economic structures. Nehru returned to India in 1912, called to the bar and began practicing at the Allahabad High Court. Though he made a formal entry into the legal profession, it was clear to those around him, and increasingly to himself, that he lacked enthusiasm for it. The law held little appeal. What drew his attention far more powerfully was the growing nationalist movement, fueled by leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak and the rising star of Indian politics, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. It was around this time that Nehru began attending sessions of the Indian National Congress. His first Congress meeting was in 1912 in Patna. Though the Congress was then dominated by moderates who believed in petitioning the British for reforms, Nehru was unimpressed. He saw it as an upper-class English-speaking club, disconnected from the masses. However, he also recognized it as a potential vehicle for change. As India's political climate became more charged, Nehru was increasingly drawn into the vortex of nationalistic energy. His personal life also advanced during this period. In 1916, he married Kamala Kaul, a woman from a distinguished Kashmiri Pandit family. Kamala was only 16 at the time of their marriage, while Nehru was 26. Despite the age gap, the couple shared a deep bond, and Kamala would become an important figure in Nehru's life and public image. The following year, their daughter, Indira Priyadarshini Nehru, was born. She would go on to become one of the most consequential figures in Indian history as Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. By 1919, Nehru had firmly turned away from legal practice and committed himself to public service and political activism. The turning point came with the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in April 1919, when British troops fired on unarmed civilians in Amritsar. The event shocked the conscience of the nation, and Nehru's own faith in the British sense of justice collapsed completely. It marked a watershed in his political consciousness. The barrister was now fully awakened as a revolutionary. Thus, Nehru's early life, shaped by privilege, intellectual exploration, and gradual disillusionment, set the stage for a life of fierce political engagement. The next phase of his journey would take him from the courtroom to the front lines of India's freedom struggle, where he would rise not only as a leader but as the very embodiment of India's modern identity. Part 2. Emergence of a leader. Nehru and the Freedom Movement. By the early 1920s, Jawaharlal Nehru had become more than just a curious observer of Indian politics. He was an active participant and rising star within the Indian National Congress, the political party that had become the crucible of India's nationalist aspirations. While his father, Motilal Nehru, was regarded as a moderate reformist who still believed that British rule could be influenced through constitutional means, Jawaharlal began to drift towards a more radical vision, one that envisioned nothing less than full independence Purna Swaraj from the British Empire. The end of World War I had brought not hope, but repression. The draconian Rowlatt Acts of 1919, allowing the British colonial government to imprison Indians without trial, led to nationwide outrage. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre, in which hundreds of peaceful Indian civilians were killed in cold blood by British troops under General Dyer, shocked the young Nehru to his core. The massacre was a defining moment. It was no longer possible, in his view, to reconcile with the empire or hope for a gradual devolution of power. The path to independence had to be urgent, direct, and unequivocal. Nehru's first serious interaction with Mahatma Gandhi came around this time during the Lucknow session of the Congress in 1916. Initially, he was not entirely persuaded by Gandhi's doctrine of nonviolent resistance. His father, too, was skeptical, fearing Gandhi's methods would plunge the Congress into disorder. Yet, over time, Nehru came to admire Gandhi's moral clarity, charisma, and ability to mobilize masses in a way no Indian leader had done before. By 1920, as Gandhi launched the non-cooperation movement, Nehru had thrown in his lot with the Mahatma. He began organizing protests and boycotts of British institutions in the United Provinces, modern-day Uttar Pradesh. His efforts did not go unnoticed. In December 1921, he was arrested for the first time on charges of anti-government activity and sentenced to prison. It would be the first of 9 detentions over the next 2.5 decades, amounting to more than 9 years behind bars in total. But Nehru accepted imprisonment with equanimity. He understood that jail time was now part of the path to national liberation. As the 1920s progressed, Nehru became a vital figure in bridging the gap between India's political elite and its restive youth. Unlike older Congress leaders, Nehru was young, idealistic, and relatively unburdened by compromise. He resonated with students, workers, and peasants who were growing increasingly impatient with British rule. While Gandhi represented the soul of the movement, Nehru gave it its intellectual edge. His speeches, peppered with references to global events and suffused with passion, began to capture national attention. Nehru also saw the freedom movement not merely as a nationalist struggle, but as part of a larger, global rejection of imperialism. In 1926, he traveled to Europe with his ailing wife Kamala, seeking treatment for her tuberculosis. During this time, he attended the Congress of Oppressed Nationalities in Brussels, where he met leaders from colonized countries across Asia and Africa. He was deeply inspired by the struggles of other nations and began to envision India's freedom as a precursor to a new global order of post-colonial solidarity. While in Europe, Nehru visited the Soviet Union. The trip left an indelible impression. Though he would never become a committed Marxist, Nehru was drawn to the Soviet model of planned development and economic equality. Upon his return to India, he authored articles that praised aspects of the socialist system, especially in its efforts to uplift the poor. This exposure helped him refine his vision of an independent India, not only politically sovereign, but economically just and socially progressive. By 1928, the Congress was grappling with its next step. Gandhi was still advocating dominion status, a degree of autonomy under the British Crown. Nehru, however, believed that the time had come to sever all ties with the empire. Along with Subhas Chandra Bose, he formed the Independence for India League to pressure the Congress into demanding full independence. His boldness alarmed some party elders, but thrilled the younger generation. At the Lahore session of the Congress in December 1929, Nehru was elected President of the Indian National Congress. He was just 40 years old. Under his leadership, the Congress passed the historic Purna Swaraj Resolution, which declared that India would accept nothing less than complete independence. On the midnight of 31 December 1929, Nehru hoisted the Indian tricolor on the banks of the Ravi River, symbolizing a new dawn in India's struggle. The next day, January 26, 1930, was celebrated across the country as India's first Independence Day, a tradition that laid the foundation for the Republic's adoption of that date 2 decades later. The symbolic act of flag hoisting was matched by practical resistance. Civil disobedience campaigns intensified. Nehru, though initially skeptical about using salt as the issue to launch a mass movement, quickly embraced Gandhi's Salt March once he saw its symbolic potency. He ceremonially broke the salt law himself, leading a large public gathering, and was arrested soon afterward. His imprisonment only increased his stature. Nehru's writings during his years in prison further strengthened his position as an intellectual leader of the movement. His books, Glimpses of World History, an autobiography, and later The Discovery of India, became manifestos of Indian identity and aspirations. They articulated a vision of India not as a fragmented collection of regions and religions, but as a timeless civilization poised for modern rebirth. Through literature and action, Nehru was giving shape to the idea of India. By the mid-1930s, Gandhi had effectively begun grooming Nehru as his political successor. Though their views often diverged, Nehru's socialism and modernism occasionally clashed with Gandhi's more traditional, rural-focused approach. There remained deep mutual respect. Gandhi appreciated Nehru's intellect and moral integrity, while Nehru admired Gandhi's unparalleled connection with the masses. Their partnership, though complex, formed the bedrock of India's freedom movement. Nehru's emergence as a national leader was now complete. He was no longer merely the son of Motilal Nehru or the disciple of Gandhi. He was the face of a modern India, aspiring, educated, egalitarian, and fiercely determined to shape its own future. Part 3. The Road to Independence. Leadership in the Crucible of Crisis. As the 1930s unfolded, Jawaharlal Nehru's prominence within the Indian National Congress solidified, and with it came both immense responsibility and complex challenges. India's struggle for freedom entered a more intense phase, no longer a remote ideal but a tangible goal whose path was riddled with both hope and hardship. Nehru emerged not only as Gandhi's closest political ally but as the voice of a new generation of Indians who sought liberty, justice, and equality in a rapidly changing global context. The Salt Satyagraha of 1930 had created a wave of momentum, and Nehru, fresh from jail and more popular than ever, became a rallying point for radical energy within the movement. His incarceration had turned him into a national hero. But Nehru, never one to romanticize sacrifice, quickly returned to active politics and strategizing. He saw clearly that independence would be achieved not only through mass movements but also through negotiation, education, and international diplomacy. The early 1930s were marked by intermittent negotiations with the British government. The Round Table conferences in London, convened to explore constitutional reforms, saw Gandhi participating, but Nehru remained skeptical of British sincerity. Meanwhile, Nehru's internationalist outlook took shape further through his work with the League Against Imperialism and his growing awareness of rising fascist threats in Europe. He warned that imperialism abroad and fascism at home were connected by their reliance on repression, hierarchy, and militarism. In 1935, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act, which offered a new federal structure and expanded provincial autonomy. Nehru was unimpressed. He famously referred to the act as a machine with strong brakes but no engine. He viewed it as another attempt by the British to delay genuine independence and keep real power in their own hands. Nonetheless, as Congress debated its response, Nehru remained pragmatic. He initially opposed contesting the 1937 provincial elections under the Act, but eventually agreed, viewing the elections as an opportunity to engage with the Indian masses and demonstrate the Congress's strength through governance. The elections of 1937 were a landmark. The Indian National Congress won decisively in 7 of 11 provinces. Nehru led a vigorous campaign across the country, bringing unprecedented numbers to political rallies. The Congress ministries now controlled significant provincial governments, offering a chance to experiment with policies reflecting Congress ideals, land reform, education, labor rights, and secular governance. Nehru, however, remained dissatisfied. For him, governance was not enough. India remained shackled, and the structural inequities of colonialism persisted. He pushed the Congress to articulate a broader vision for post-independence India. In 1931, Nehru had already drafted a Fundamental Rights and Economic Program resolution which, although ratified 2 years later in the Karachi session of Congress, gained renewed attention now. It outlined principles such as freedom of speech, equality before law, abolition of untouchability, and universal education. These ideals would later find expression in the Indian Constitution. The late 1930s were also years of personal turmoil. Nehru's beloved wife Kamala had long battled tuberculosis. Her health steadily declined, and Nehru's political duties were now accompanied by deep emotional strain. He took Kamala to Switzerland for treatment, staying by her side during her final days. Her death in 1936 devastated him. Yet, the tragedy also deepened his resolve to serve the nation with greater intensity. Kamala's quiet strength and dignity had sustained him, and her passing left a void he filled with action and service. In the same year, Nehru was elected President of the Indian National Congress for a second time. As the international scene darkened with the rise of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, Nehru's rhetoric became more strident. He repeatedly warned that the fight against British imperialism was part of a global struggle against tyranny. He was especially critical of Indian leaders, including many within Congress, who sought to remain neutral in global conflicts. Nehru believed India's soul lay with democracy and the defeat of fascism. In 1939, when World War II broke out, Viceroy Lord Linlithgow unilaterally declared India a participant in the conflict without consulting Indian leaders. The Congress ministries resigned en masse in protest. Nehru was particularly incensed. Despite his disdain for Nazi ideology, he found it unacceptable that a colony could be dragged into a global war while denied even a pretense of self-government. His correspondence from this period reveals both his fury and his moral anguish. While Nehru and the Congress were sidelined, the Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, began consolidating its position. In 1940, Jinnah presented the Lahore Resolution, calling for a separate homeland for Muslims Pakistan. Nehru responded with alarm and disbelief. He rejected the notion that India's Muslims were a separate nation and insisted on a secular, pluralistic India. This divergence would set the stage for future conflict and eventually partition. Meanwhile, the British government sent Sir Stafford Cripps to India in 1942 with a proposal that promised dominion status after the war and a constituent assembly to draft a constitution. Nehru, always eager for negotiation, considered the offer seriously. However, the vague language and exclusion of Congress from immediate governance led to its rejection. Gandhi, disillusioned by repeated British duplicity, launched the Quit India movement in August 1942. Though Nehru had misgivings, he feared it might weaken the Allied war effort against fascism. He stood by Gandhi's call. He was arrested along with the entire Congress Working Committee and jailed for almost 3 years. Nehru spent much of this incarceration in the Ahmednagar fort, where he wrote The Discovery of India, a sweeping meditation on Indian history, philosophy, and culture. It was part memoir, part historical analysis, and part political manifesto. In it, Nehru sought to define India not just as a political entity, but as a civilizational force, resilient, inclusive, and endlessly diverse. By the time Nehru was released in 1945, the world had changed. The war had ended. The British Empire was weakened and weary. In India, the political landscape had shifted. The Muslim League had grown in strength, and communal tensions were escalating. Yet, despite the looming crisis, Nehru remained focused. He knew that India was on the brink of freedom, but he also sensed that the cost might be high. As India's principal negotiator with the departing British, Nehru would now face the hardest decisions of his life, balancing unity with the realities of partition, steering India toward democracy amidst chaos, and laying the foundation of a nation still to be born. Part 4. Midnight's Children. Partition, Independence, and the Republic. As World War II came to a close in 1945, Britain's once mighty empire stood financially and morally depleted. The global tide had turned against colonialism, and in India, the pressure for self-rule had reached an irreversible crescendo. Released from his longest prison term in June of that year, Jawaharlal Nehru returned to a political landscape vastly altered. The British now faced a reinvigorated Indian National Congress, a surging Muslim League under Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and a people no longer willing to wait for freedom. Despite his years in prison, Nehru remained at the forefront of the Congress. Upon his release, he plunged immediately into negotiations and public rallies. India was on the edge of transformation, but also teetering toward communal fragmentation. The Quit India movement had not only revealed the depth of Indian resolve, but also exacerbated the rift between Hindus and Muslims. The Muslim League, largely spared from the wave of arrests that had swept Congress leaders, had used the intervening years to expand its reach. In the 1946 provincial elections, it won almost every seat reserved for Muslims, reinforcing its claim to be the sole representative of Muslim India. Nehru, as always, remained steadfast in his commitment to a united India. He rejected Jinnah's two-nation theory, believing it to be an affront to the millennia-old cultural, linguistic, and spiritual pluralism that defined the subcontinent. India, in his view, was one civilization composed of many communities, not a land to be divided by faith. He envisioned an independent nation, where Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and all others would live together in democratic harmony. But time and events began to close that window. In March 1946, the British cabinet mission arrived in India with the goal of proposing a peaceful transfer of power. The mission recommended a united India with a loose federation, but Jinnah demanded a sovereign Pakistan. Nehru, who became interim prime minister in September 1946, reluctantly accepted the cabinet mission plan as a temporary arrangement. The League briefly joined the interim government in October, but deep mistrust and ideological opposition made cooperation impossible. Communal riots broke out across the country. The Great Calcutta Killings in August 1946, followed by violence in Noakhali, Bihar, and Punjab, shattered any remaining illusion that partition could be avoided without bloodshed. Nehru was shaken not only by the violence, but by the psychological collapse of Indian unity. Despite his best efforts, the demand for Pakistan had become a political reality, supported by a large section of Indian Muslims. The British, exhausted and seeking a swift exit, handed the final task to Lord Louis Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India. When Mountbatten announced in June 1947 that India would be granted independence 2 months later, Nehru knew the cost would be high. The rushed process left little time for careful planning. Partition was inevitable. On 15 August 1947, India awakened to freedom. Nehru's speech that day, Tryst with Destiny, is one of the most iconic in world history. Standing before the Constituent Assembly, Nehru declared, "Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. It was a moment of immense pride but also profound sorrow. Partition resulted in one of the largest and most violent forced migrations in human history. An estimated 10 to 15 million people crossed borders. At least 1 million lost their lives in brutal sectarian massacres. Nehru, like Gandhi, was devastated. He toured refugee camps in riot-affected areas, giving impassioned speeches for peace and unity, though often standing amid overwhelming chaos and despair. Worse still, just 5 months after independence, on 30 January 1948, Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated in Delhi by Nathuram Godse, a Hindu extremist who blamed Gandhi's conciliatory stance toward Muslims for India's partition and Pakistan's creation. The murder of Gandhi was not only a personal loss for Nehru, it was a moral blow to a fledgling nation. In a radio address to the nation, Nehru said, "The light has gone out of our lives, and there is darkness everywhere. I do not know what to tell you or how to say it. Our beloved leader is no more." In the wake of Gandhi's death, Nehru, alongside Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, took swift steps to consolidate the Indian state. Both the Hindu Mahasabha and the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, were curtailed. Hundreds of extremists were arrested. But Nehru understood that India's survival would depend not merely on punitive action but on constitutional strength, secularism, and unity. On 26 January 1950, less than 3 years after independence, India officially became a republic. The Indian Constitution came into force, and Nehru assumed office as the first Prime Minister of the Republic of India. The Constitution enshrined a vision that Nehru had long championed: liberty, equality, secularism, social justice, and a democratic parliamentary system. During these formative years, Nehru and Patel worked together to integrate over 560 princely states into the Indian Union. Though Nehru often took a firm tone in public, declaring that princely states could not remain independent, he entrusted much of the sensitive diplomacy to Patel and his aide VP, Menon. By 1950, most of the subcontinent's complex political map had been unified into a single sovereign republic. An extraordinary feat considering the potential for fragmentation. As India stepped onto the world stage, Nehru also turned his attention outward. His commitment to non-alignment and anti-colonialism gained him international stature. At home, however, challenges remained staggering. Communal wounds still raw, millions displaced, economic development urgent, and democratic institutions still embryonic. In these fragile early years, Nehru became not just a prime minister, but a nation builder. His decisions, personality, and vision would set the tone for decades to come. Though the trauma of partition left scars, Nehru was determined to move India forward, to heal, to unite, and to begin crafting what he called a noble mansion of freedom. The Republic had been born amidst bloodshed, but it carried within it the dreams of millions. Nehru's leadership, tested in crisis, now faced the far more formidable challenge of governance, reconstruction, and moral stewardship. Part 5. The Making of a Nation. Nehru's Domestic Vision and Challenges. With the birth of the Indian Republic on 26 January 1950, Jawaharlal Nehru stood at the helm of a nation that was free, sovereign, and democratic, but also fractured, impoverished, and scarred by the trauma of partition. As the first Prime Minister of independent India, Nehru was tasked with more than administration. He had to create, from the vestiges of a colonized and fragmented society, a coherent national identity rooted in unity, liberty, and modernity. The next chapter of his life would be defined not by a revolution, but by reconstruction and by the tremendous effort to lift an entire nation out of the ruins of colonialism and into the promise of a new age. Nehru's vision for India was rooted in three central pillars: democracy, secularism, and socialism. These ideals were not abstract theories for him. They were deeply practical frameworks for nation building. For Nehru, democracy meant more than periodic elections. It meant cultivating habits of debate, tolerance, and institutional accountability. India, with its bewildering diversity of languages, religions, castes, and ethnicities, could only survive if it gave equal voice to all its citizens. He was unwavering in his commitment to universal adult suffrage. In a world where many newly decolonized nations slid into autocracy, Nehru made sure that India, despite widespread illiteracy and poverty, would hold free and fair elections from the very beginning. The first general elections of 1951–52 were monumental. Over 173 million people were eligible to vote, and the process involved more than 200 political parties and independent candidates. The logistical challenge was unprecedented. Ballot boxes had to be transported by foot, bullock carts, boats, and even elephants to the most remote corners of the country. Nehru campaigned tirelessly, not just for the Indian National Congress, but for the very idea of democracy itself. When the results were declared, the Congress Party won a sweeping mandate, securing 364 of 489 seats in the Lok Sabha. Nehru was reaffirmed as Prime Minister with overwhelming public support. His government now set about implementing reforms that reflected his long-held ideals. One of his first major efforts was land reform. In a country where feudal structures and landlordism had dominated rural life for centuries, Nehru sought to redistribute land and end exploitative systems such as the zamindari. While some success was achieved, particularly in states like Kerala and West Bengal, the reforms were uneven and often stymied by local political interests. Nonetheless, the move was symbolic. It represented a moral break from the colonial and feudal past. Education was another cornerstone of Nehru's domestic agenda. He believed that science and rationality were essential tools for development and national cohesion. "It is science alone," he once said, "that can solve the problems of hunger and poverty, of insanitation and illiteracy, of superstition and deadening custom and tradition." To this end, he established a network of institutions designed to promote scientific research and technological advancement: the Indian Institutes of Technology, IITs, the Indian Institutes of Management, IIMs, and the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, AIIMs. These institutions were not just centers of learning, they were envisioned as the engines of modern India. Nehru also emphasized industrialization as the path to economic self-reliance. He was deeply influenced by the Soviet model of five-year plans and state-led industrial growth. Under his leadership, India launched its first five-year plan in 1951, focusing on agriculture, irrigation, and infrastructure. Subsequent plans prioritized the development of heavy industries, such as steel, coal, and power generation. Nehru called these projects the temples of modern India. Massive public sector enterprises like the Vilai Steel Plant and the Damodar Valley Corporation became symbols of national pride and progress. Yet Nehru's economic model, later called the Nehruvian Consensus, had its critics. While it aimed for self-sufficiency and equitable distribution, it also generated inefficiencies. Excessive bureaucracy, over-regulation, often referred to as the license Raj, and a lack of private sector dynamism slowed India's economic growth. Critics argued that the state's dominant role in the economy stifled innovation and entrepreneurship. But Nehru remained convinced that rapid industrialization under public control was necessary to lift millions out of poverty and avoid the inequalities he saw in capitalist systems. Another defining feature of Nehru's domestic vision was secularism. In the aftermath of partition, communal tensions ran high, and the idea of a pluralist India was under constant threat. Nehru was unequivocal in his rejection of religious majoritarianism. He believed that the state must be neutral in matters of religion, providing equal protection and dignity to all communities. This was not merely a matter of tolerance but of national survival. India, with its vast mosaic of beliefs and practices, could not afford the dominance of any one religious group. This secular vision faced numerous challenges. Communal riots, political mobilization on religious lines, and demands for special status from different religious and regional groups constantly tested the fabric of the republic. Yet Nehru stood firm. He refused to ban cow slaughter despite demands from Hindu conservatives, and he opposed a uniform civil code at the time, choosing instead a gradual approach to legal reform that respected religious sensitivities while upholding constitutional principles. Despite his towering stature, Nehru was not immune to criticism. His emphasis on central planning and heavy industry often neglected agriculture, which still employed the majority of India's population. Food shortages and uneven development in rural areas sparked discontent. Furthermore, while Nehru was committed to democracy, some of his methods, such as the dismissal of opposition-led state governments under Article 356, were viewed as authoritarian. Still, Nehru governed with a moral compass rarely seen in modern politics. He remained accessible, introspective, and above all, principled. His speeches in Parliament were eloquent and rich with historical and philosophical references. He answered questions with patience, tolerated dissent, and maintained a tone of civility and reason, setting a standard for democratic discourse in India. On the cultural front, Nehru worked to shape an Indian identity that embraced diversity and modernity without rejecting its past. He supported the development of institutions like the Sahitya Akademi, Sangeet Natak Akademi, and the National School of Drama to promote Indian arts and literature. He also encouraged archaeological research and heritage preservation, believing that a strong sense of history was essential to national unity. As the 1950s drew to a close, India had changed dramatically. Though poverty remained widespread and challenges persisted, there was a palpable sense of progress, of a nation finding its voice and its footing. Nehru's policies were not without flaws, but they were rooted in a sincere and far-sighted vision, a vision shaped by his commitment to justice, equality, and reason. For Nehru, governance was not just a matter of policy, but of character. He understood the immense responsibilities of leadership in a pluralistic democracy and worked tirelessly to uphold the ideals he had fought for in the freedom struggle. In the process, he laid the foundation of an India that would continue to evolve, question, and aspire. Part 6. India and the World. Nehru's Foreign Policy and Non-Alignment. As India emerged from the shadows of colonialism, Jawaharlal Nehru recognized that the nation's destiny would not be shaped solely within its borders. The world was changing rapidly, and Nehru believed that India, with its unique heritage and democratic aspirations, must carve out a principled and independent space in international affairs. His foreign policy vision, anchored in moral clarity and pragmatic realism, would come to define the country's international identity for decades. In the aftermath of World War II, the global stage was dominated by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. As the Cold War intensified, nations around the world were compelled to align themselves with one of these rival camps. Nehru, however, resisted this binary logic. He feared that ideological polarization would endanger peace and undermine the sovereignty of newly independent nations. Thus, He pioneered the doctrine of non-alignment, a policy of strategic independence that refused to place India under the influence of either bloc. The idea of non-alignment was not about political neutrality or passivity. For Nehru, it was an active stance, rooted in the principles of anti-colonialism, peaceful coexistence, and international cooperation. India would engage with the world, support liberation movements, and speak out against injustice. But it would do so without compromising its autonomy. In this way, Nehru sought to amplify India's moral voice on the global stage and offer an alternative to the aggressive power politics of the Cold War. One of Nehru's earliest foreign policy moves was to champion the rights of colonized peoples. He lent strong support to Indonesia's independence from Dutch colonial rule in 1947, hosted the Asian Relations Conference in New Delhi that same year, and consistently advocated for the end of colonialism in Africa and Southeast Asia. These actions positioned India as a leader of the global South, a voice for oppressed nations seeking dignity and self-determination. This vision reached its most institutional form with the founding of the Non-Aligned Movement, NAM. Officially launched in 1961 at the Belgrade Conference, alongside leaders like Josip Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and Sukarno of Indonesia. Though the formal conference occurred later in his premiership, the intellectual and ideological foundations of NAM were laid much earlier by Nehru's speeches, diplomacy, and strategic positioning. Nehru's belief in peaceful coexistence was also visible in his approach to international conflict. While he was deeply committed to democracy and individual freedoms, he did not let ideological differences dictate diplomatic engagement. He maintained cordial relations with the Soviet Union while also fostering ties with the United States, particularly in the realms of education and economic development. India received significant aid and technical support from both nations, a diplomatic balancing act that underscored Nehru's principle of non-alignment. A critical test of Nehru's foreign policy came with the Korean War, 1950–53. India took a mediating role, refusing to send troops, but actively participating in efforts to broker peace. Nehru's insistence on negotiation over aggression won India considerable respect in international circles. His stature as a peacemaker was further reinforced during the Suez Crisis of 1956, when he condemned the invasion of Egypt by British, French, and Israeli forces, a bold stance that won him admiration across the Arab world. However, Nehru's commitment to peace was challenged by a series of border disputes, particularly with China. Initially, Nehru had high hopes for India-China relations. In 1954, India signed the Panchsheel Agreement with China, outlining 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Nehru welcomed Premier Zhou Enlai to Delhi and famously proclaimed the slogan, "Hindi Chini Bye Bye." Indians and Chinese are brothers. He believed that India and China, as ancient civilizations and fellow victims of imperialism, could jointly lead Asia toward a new era of solidarity. But beneath this optimism, tensions were growing. China's annexation of Tibet in 1950 had alarmed Indian strategists, and when the Dalai Lama fled to India in 1959 following a failed uprising against Chinese rule, relations began to unravel. Border skirmishes escalated into a full-blown conflict in October 1962. The Sino-Indian War was a national trauma for India and a personal blow to Nehru. The Chinese forces swiftly advanced into Indian territory, exposing India's unpreparedness and shattering Nehru's image of unassailable leadership. The war ended with China declaring a unilateral ceasefire and withdrawing from some occupied territories, but the damage to Nehru's credibility was profound. Critics accused him of naivete in trusting China without adequately strengthening India's military defenses. For a leader who had invested so much political capital in diplomacy and moral authority, the defeat was devastating. The war marked a turning point. Nehru, once buoyed by idealism, became more cautious and pragmatic in his final years. Defense spending was increased, military reforms were initiated, and India began to reconsider its strategic isolation. While Nehru never abandoned the principles of non-alignment, the events of 1962 brought a sobering realism to India's foreign policy. Despite the setback with China, Nehru's broader international stature remained formidable. He continued to speak out against nuclear proliferation, colonial oppression, and racial segregation, particularly in apartheid-era South Africa. He advocated for disarmament at a time when the superpowers were stockpiling weapons of mass destruction. At the United Nations and other global forums, India's voice carried moral weight, a legacy of Nehru's consistent advocacy for peace and justice. Nehru's foreign policy legacy is complex. On one hand, he successfully established India as a respected global actor, committed to sovereignty, dialogue, and ethical statecraft. On the other, critics have argued that his idealism sometimes blinded him to hard realities, particularly in matters of national security. Still, even his detractors acknowledge the ambition and originality of his vision. Few leaders of his era dared to chart a course so independent, or to speak for so many without seeking dominion over any. In the final analysis, Nehru's approach to world affairs mirrored his deepest convictions that moral leadership, intellectual rigor, and principled action were not luxuries in diplomacy, they were its very foundation. As India grew into its role on the world stage, it did so under the shadow and example of Nehru's distinctive voice, a statesman of peace in a world tilting toward war, and a champion of freedom in a century marked by conquest and division. Part 7. Legacy and Leadership. Nehru's Final Years and Enduring Impact. As the 1960s unfolded, Jawaharlal Nehru, now in his 70s, remained the towering figure of Indian politics, admired, trusted, and deeply embedded in the fabric of the nation. But the responsibilities of leadership had taken their toll. The idealistic fervor of his youth had been tempered by years of governance, global tensions, and domestic complexities. Despite mounting challenges, Nehru continued to serve as Prime Minister, driven by a sense of unfinished duty and a deep emotional connection with the India he had helped free and guide. After the debacle of the Sino-Indian War in 1962, Nehru's aura of invincibility dimmed. The nation, once buoyed by his dreams of fraternity and peaceful coexistence, now looked inward with anxiety. The war exposed India's military vulnerabilities and cast doubts over Nehru's judgment. He responded not with retreat but with resolve. Though personally shaken, he initiated major reforms in defense preparedness, boosting military funding and modernizing India's armed forces. He also accepted foreign aid and technical support more pragmatically, including assistance from both the U.S. and Soviet Union, signaling a shift from strict non-alignment to conditional collaboration. Nehru's health, however, was in slow decline. Years of tireless work, stress, and emotional strain had begun to affect him visibly. Friends and colleagues noted that the grief of Gandhi's assassination, the untimely death of his wife Kamala, and the shock of partition had left psychological scars. The blow of the 1962 war added a final burden. Yet Nehru refused to consider retirement. He believed India still needed his leadership as it moved from its fragile beginnings toward institutional maturity. Domestically, Nehru faced the growing pains of a democratic nation undergoing rapid transformation. Economic development had brought new opportunities, but also new inequalities. The public sector dominated the economy, but inefficiency and corruption had begun to creep into the state machinery. The License Raj, originally intended to ensure equitable distribution and regulation, often stifled entrepreneurship and fostered bureaucratic red tape. Unemployment, inflation, and rural stagnation challenged the optimism of the five-year plans. Opposition to the Congress Party also began to strengthen during this time. The formation of regional parties and ideological groups such as the Swatantra Party, which advocated for economic liberalism, and the socialist factions to Congress's left indicated a diversification of India's political discourse. While Nehru welcomed dissent in principle, the Congress Party had, under his long rule, become synonymous with governance itself. Critics argued that the lack of internal democracy within the party was becoming a weakness. Though he was not authoritarian by temperament, Nehru's moral and intellectual dominance left little space for competing voices within the Congress hierarchy. Even as his critics grew more vocal, Nehru's stature as a global leader remained intact. In 1963, during a visit to India, U.S. President John F. Kennedy described Nehru as one of the greatest men of the century. Nehru continued to attend international summits, speak eloquently at the United Nations, and host visiting heads of state with characteristic charm and sophistication. His advocacy for nuclear disarmament, anti-colonialism, and Afro-Asian solidarity kept India at the moral center of the post-war world. In his personal life, Nehru grew increasingly close to his daughter, Indira Gandhi. Widowed early, Indira had taken on many responsibilities in managing Nehru's affairs, both domestic and political. Though she initially avoided politics, Nehru saw in her a potential leader capable, resolute, and emotionally resilient. In 1964, she was serving as Minister of Information and Broadcasting in Lal Bahadur Shastri's cabinet, and her political apprenticeship was in full swing. Though Nehru never openly endorsed her as a successor, many within the Congress Party viewed her as the natural heir to his legacy. Despite his declining health, Nehru kept up a demanding schedule. He continued writing and corresponding with diplomats, scientists, artists, and politicians. His final months were marked by an increased focus on education and institutional reform. He worked closely with figures like Homi Bhabha in advancing India's nuclear research, supported agricultural reforms that would soon evolve into the Green Revolution, and pushed for expansion in primary and technical education. On 27 May 1964, Jawaharlal Nehru died suddenly of a heart attack. The news plunged India into mourning. Across the nation, millions wept openly. In cities and villages, people gathered around radios to listen to tributes. International leaders from across ideological divides paid homage. Lyndon B. Johnson called him a friend of peace. Soviet Premier Khrushchev called his death an irreparable loss for the entire progressive mankind. His body lay in state at Teen Murti Bhavan, his official residence in Delhi, and was visited by thousands. His cremation at the banks of the Yamuna River, witnessed by a sea of people, became one of the most solemn public events in India's history. As his ashes were scattered from an aircraft over the Ganges, India seemed to bid farewell not just to a leader, but to an era. The legacy Nehru left behind was complex, profound, and enduring. He had presided over India's transformation from a colony into a republic, from a society based on hierarchy and superstition to one guided by law, science, and equality. He had laid the foundation for democratic institutions, industrial infrastructure, and cultural openness. His flaws were real. He misjudged threats, underestimated bureaucracy, and over-centralized planning, but his vision and sincerity were never in doubt. Nehru's leadership was defined by moral conviction, intellectual depth, and an unwavering belief in India's civilizational potential. He was not merely a politician, but a philosopher king in the classical sense, a man who thought deeply, felt deeply, and governed not to rule, but to serve. His faith in democratic pluralism gave India the confidence to imagine a future beyond caste, creed, and region. In time, the nation would reassess and debate his legacy, as all great democracies do with their founders. But even as later generations questioned his policies or chose different paths, they continued to walk along roads he had laid. In every Indian election, every IIT graduate, every secular law, and every democratic protest, there remains something of Nehru's spirit, idealistic, resilient, and endlessly striving toward a more just world. Part 8. The Personal and the Political. Nehru's Character, Relationships, and Writings. Behind the towering image of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, the strategist, parliamentarian, and international statesman, stood a deeply human figure, a man of remarkable intellect, emotional depth, and profound contradictions. Throughout his life, Nehru was as much a thinker and writer as he was a political leader. His personal life, relationships, and literary output were intricately woven into the political journey he undertook. The story of Nehru, the man, reveals the emotional, philosophical, and introspective dimensions of a leader often associated with the weight of institutions and ideology. Nehru was, at his core, a product of many worlds. Born into privilege and educated in the intellectual circles of Harrow, Cambridge, and the Inner Temple in London, he possessed a deep understanding of Western liberal thought. Yet, his soul remained rooted in the Indian civilizational tradition, spiritual without being religious, modern without being westernized. This duality defined much of his worldview. It gave him the ability to speak to both villagers and diplomats, to think across ideologies, and to lead a nation with one foot in the ancient and another in the modern. His personality was shaped not only by historical events but by intimate losses and personal solitude. His marriage to Kamala Nehru in 1916 was traditional in form but deeply emotional in experience. Kamala, a quiet and unassuming figure, became his steadfast companion during the early years of his political awakening. Despite long separations, often due to Nehru's imprisonments or her failing health, their bond remained strong. Her death in 1936 from tuberculosis in a sanatorium in Switzerland devastated Nehru. In one of his letters, he wrote of her with moving tenderness, "She was so fragile and so strong. Her strength was not the strength of assertion, but of silence and sacrifice." Kamala's passing left Nehru emotionally adrift. His relationship with his daughter Indira became the emotional anchor of his life. Indira Gandhi, often by his side during travels and political events, shared his loneliness and political dedication. Though he initially discouraged her from entering politics directly, he trusted her judgment and leaned on her companionship in his later years. Their correspondence, voluminous, thoughtful, and occasionally playful, reveals a father deeply invested in shaping his daughter's mind while respecting her individuality. Nehru's friendships, too, were distinctive. He formed close bonds with leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, whose moral rigor both inspired and challenged him. Their relationship was intellectually rich and sometimes contentious, especially on matters such as economic models, religion, and methods of resistance. But the trust between them remained unshaken. Gandhi saw in Nehru the man most capable of carrying forward India's ideals after independence, and Nehru, in turn, accepted Gandhi as the conscience of the movement, even when he disagreed with him. Internationally, Nehru cultivated friendships with statesmen such as Joseph Broz Tito, Kwame Nkrumah, and Gamal Abdel Nasser, fellow leaders of decolonized nations who shared his vision of a new global order. Yet Nehru's inner circle was never wide. He remained something of an introvert, preferring books, gardens, and long walks to crowds and flattery. This inner world found expression in his prolific writing. Nehru's works were not ghost-written political manifestos. They were deeply personal, reflective, and crafted with literary grace. During his imprisonments, which totaled nearly a decade, he wrote thousands of letters, essays, and books. An autobiography, 1936, also known as Toward Freedom, provides a remarkably honest account of his political evolution and philosophical beliefs. It candidly discusses his moments of doubt, his relationships, and his ideological transformations. His Glimpses of World History, a collection of nearly 200 letters written from prison to his daughter Indira between 1930 and 1933, offers a sweeping narrative of world events and civilizations. It was his attempt to educate Indira in the absence of school, using history as a vehicle to instill values of curiosity, justice, and compassion. What makes the book extraordinary is its perspective. Nehru, from a jail cell, writing about Caesar, Akbar, Napoleon, and Marx, weaving a tapestry of global history with clarity and humanity. Later, in 1944-45, while imprisoned in Ahmednagar Fort, he wrote The Discovery of India, arguably his most important work. The book is both a historical survey and a personal meditation. It explores India's spiritual traditions, philosophical achievements, and cultural diversity, while also interrogating its weaknesses, social inequality, caste hierarchies, and fatalism. Nehru presented India not as a static, mystical land, but as a living, evolving civilization, poised for modern rebirth. These writings were more than educational. They were acts of intellectual resistance. In a time when India's political leaders were being silenced or jailed, Nehru turned to the written word to keep the flame of national consciousness alive. His books inspired generations of readers to view India not merely as a geographical entity, but as an idea, dynamic, inclusive, and forward-looking. Despite his rationalist leanings, Nehru held a quiet reverence for India's spiritual depth. He did not subscribe to religious dogma or rituals, but he found great meaning in the philosophical essence of Hinduism, Buddhism, and other Indian traditions. In The Discovery of India, he wrote, "The Gita is not for the faint-hearted. It is for the strong, for those who aim at a certain intensity and effort of the spirit." His own spirituality was of the mind rather than the temple. Nehru's aesthetic sense was another lesser-known but vital aspect of his character. He loved art, architecture, and classical music. He supported institutions that preserved and promoted Indian culture, seeing in them both continuity and renewal. His speeches, often poetic, were sprinkled with references to Shakespeare, Keats, the Upanishads, and historical figures from both East and West. He understood symbolism and ceremonial gesture, not for vanity, but for the cohesion they could bring to a young nation struggling to define itself. Yet Nehru was not without emotional contradictions. His introspective nature often led to self-doubt. In letters and diaries, he expressed moments of melancholy, feelings of loneliness, and a haunting awareness of the burden of leadership. He once confided, "I have become a myth, a symbol. It is not easy to live as a myth." Despite the acclaim and reverence he commanded, he yearned for personal connection and understanding. In his later years, especially after the loss of Gandhi and the partition carnage, Nehru grew more solemn. Though he retained his idealism, he grew more conscious of the limits of politics and the fragility of human progress. Still, he persisted in parliament, in writing, and in daily governance because he believed, above all, in the act of striving. He remained a leader who, even in disappointment, chose effort over resignation. Jawaharlal Nehru was not just the architect of a political India, but also of a moral and intellectual India. Through his words, relationships, and character, He offered his country more than governance. He gave it a model of how to think, question, and dream. His life was proof that leadership, at its best, is not just about power, but about vision, empathy, and enduring service. Part 9. Interpreting Nehru. Criticism, controversy, and historical reassessment. No figure in Indian political history has been as revered or as intensely debated as Jawaharlal Nehru. While his central role in shaping modern India is uncontested, the legacy he left behind has been interpreted, scrutinized, and contested in myriad ways. Over the decades since his death, Nehru has become both a symbol of India's finest ideals and a target for its deepest frustrations. Understanding his place in history requires examining not just what he achieved, but also what he could not, and how his vision continues to provoke dialogue in a nation he helped to define. Criticism of Nehru's policies began even during his lifetime. His approach to economic development, commonly termed the Nehruvian model, emphasized state-led industrialization and centralized planning. Proponents hailed this as necessary for lifting a largely agrarian, impoverished country into the modern age. But detractors argue that it also created a vast and inefficient bureaucracy, stifled private enterprise, and bred a culture of red tape that would haunt India for decades. The License Raj, a system of permits and approvals required to start and run businesses, became synonymous with corruption and stagnation. Economists and political commentators have since argued that while Nehru's intentions were rooted in equity and national self-reliance, his execution often fell short in fostering innovation, competition, or consumer choice. The pace of economic growth under his leadership remained modest, and his preference for heavy industries arguably overlooked the urgency of rural reform and agriculture-based development. Nehru's foreign policy, too, has attracted intense scrutiny. His doctrine of non-alignment, though morally admirable, has been questioned for lacking strategic clarity in the face of geopolitical realities. His optimism regarding China, culminating in the Panchsheel Agreement and the slogan, "Hindi Chini Bye-Bye," ended disastrously in the 1962 Sino-Indian War. Critics have called this a major diplomatic and military failure, a moment when Nehru's idealism collided with realpolitik, leaving the nation exposed and humiliated. Some have also raised concerns about Nehru's handling of Kashmir, a subject that continues to shape regional conflict. His decision to refer the matter to the United Nations, as well as his failure to implement plebiscite resolutions, have led opponents to question his strategy and foresight. Supporters argue that he inherited a situation fraught with complexity and acted under the pressure of moral responsibility and constitutional legality, particularly given his commitment to secularism and federal integration. But even they acknowledge that the Kashmir question remained one of the most intractable challenges of his premiership. Beyond policy, Nehru's democratic credentials have occasionally come under fire. While he championed free speech and parliamentary institutions, his government did invoke Article 356 of the Constitution multiple times to dismiss elected state governments, a practice that later became a tool for political manipulation. Critics accuse him of laying the foundation for a centralized executive, even while building a democratic system. His long dominance over the Congress Party without meaningful internal opposition has been interpreted by some as contributing to the culture of personality-driven politics in India. Nehru's cultural and educational vision, too, has been contested. His emphasis on secularism, rationalism, and scientific temper was hailed as modern and progressive. Yet, in recent decades, these very values have come under attack by groups who see them as dismissive of India's religious traditions and indigenous knowledge systems. For some, Nehru symbolizes a westernized elite disconnected from the grassroots. For others, He is the guardian of India's pluralism, tolerance, and intellectual curiosity. In more recent times, Nehru has become a lightning rod in India's polarized political landscape. Supporters continue to venerate him as the moral and institutional architect of post-colonial India, while critics, especially from rival ideological camps, accuse him of having made foundational errors that stunted India's growth or weakened its national identity. Debates over school textbooks, historical memorials, and public commemorations often reflect these deep divisions. Yet, historical reassessment has also brought a more nuanced appreciation of Nehru's legacy. Many scholars now argue that judging Nehru by today's standards overlooks the enormous complexity of the time in which he governed. India in 1947 was a newly partitioned, traumatized, impoverished nation without a functioning administrative structure, widespread education, or a shared national consciousness. That democracy survived and even thrived under such conditions is, to many, a tribute to Nehru's institutional foresight and personal integrity. The Indian Constitution, the Election Commission, the judiciary, and the civil services, all institutions that anchor India's democracy, were strengthened under his watch. His vision of secularism, though challenged today, was foundational in keeping India united amidst its vast religious and cultural diversity. His refusal to declare Hinduism the state religion, despite immense pressure, stands as a testament to his commitment to a plural India. His handling of dissent was, by the standards of his time, remarkably restrained. Nehru frequently engaged with opposition leaders in parliament, allowed press freedom to flourish, and encouraged public debate. He believed that democracy was not simply about winning elections, but about building a culture of dialogue, tolerance, and reasoned argument. Moreover, his legacy extends far beyond government and policy. Nehru inspired generations of Indians, scientists, artists, educators, farmers, and workers to believe in the power of citizenship and collective effort. His speeches and writings continue to be taught in schools and studied in universities, not merely as political documents, but as philosophical reflections on identity, freedom, and responsibility. Even his critics often concede his stature. As Nobel laureate Amartya Sen once observed, Nehru was not a flawless leader, but he was a fundamentally decent one, a democrat with vision and civility, rare in his time and rarer now. Ultimately, Nehru's legacy lies in the space he created for institutions to mature, for dissent to be heard, for reason to guide policy, and for the poorest Indian to feel counted in the national enterprise. His failures, while real, came from ambition rather than apathy, from idealism, not indifference. He was a leader who did not merely manage India, but imagined its role in the world, its obligations to its citizens, and its potential as a civilization of both antiquity and modernity. The ongoing debates about Nehru are not signs of his irrelevance, but of his enduring imprint. His life and leadership remain a mirror in which India continues to see its past and measure its future. Part 10. Conclusion. Nehru's India and the Road Ahead. As the curtain falls on the life and times of Jawaharlal Nehru, it becomes clear that his story is not just that of an individual, but of a nation in birth, struggle, and transformation. He was not a perfect man. He made mistakes, miscalculations, and decisions that continue to spark debate. But what set him apart was the vision, integrity, and humanism that animated his politics. More than any ideology or policy framework, Nehru embodied a moral architecture for India's future, one built on pluralism, democracy, reason, and justice. When India gained independence in 1947, the country was burdened with the weight of colonial extraction, partition trauma, and deep social divisions. The subcontinent had been unified politically under the British Raj, but not as a cohesive nation. The Indian identity had yet to be forged, not by fiat, but by shared ideals and institutions. Nehru understood this fundamental reality. Unlike many revolutionary leaders, he did not see the capture of power as the end goal. For him, independence was merely the beginning, freedom was a precondition for a deeper transformation. In this regard, one of Nehru's greatest legacies is his commitment to democracy. He did not cling to power for its own sake, nor did he attempt to muzzle opposition or rewrite the Constitution to suit his personal authority. At a time when many newly decolonized nations veered into dictatorship, personality cults, or one-party rule, Nehru chose a different path. He nurtured independent institutions, the judiciary, the press, the election commission, even when they challenged his authority. He tolerated criticism, fostered debate, and sought consensus rather than coercion. His democratic sensibility extended beyond politics into culture. Nehru believed that a modern nation could not be built on fear or conformity. He wanted Indians to think freely, question deeply, and speak openly. His push for scientific temper was not just about technological advancement, it was about liberating the Indian mind from dogma and fatalism. He encouraged the arts, literature, cinema, and scholarship, not as ornamentation, but as engines of a vibrant civic life. Equally significant was his belief in secularism, not as mere tolerance, but as a core principle of governance. He envisioned an India where religion would remain a personal matter and the state would serve all communities equally. This principle was tested repeatedly in the wake of partition, during communal riots, and under political pressure from religious groups. Yet Nehru remained firm. He recognized that India's future as a stable, inclusive democracy depended on the protection of its minorities and the rejection of majoritarian nationalism. In education, Nehru laid the groundwork for a knowledge-based society. The establishment of institutions such as the IITs, IIMs, and AIIMS reflected his faith in the power of human capital. He understood that without expanding access to education and opportunity, independence would remain hollow. His emphasis on scientific research, rational inquiry, and innovation was decades ahead of its time and continues to shape India's global contributions in technology and medicine today. Nehru's economic vision, though later criticized for inefficiencies and bureaucratic overreach, stemmed from a genuine desire to achieve equitable development. He saw industrialization as key to lifting millions out of poverty, but also as a way of reclaiming India's agency after centuries of economic exploitation. His focus on public sector enterprises was driven by the belief that certain critical sectors, such as infrastructure, defense, and heavy industry, needed state support in their formative years. While the long-term results were mixed, the foundational effort to industrialize and modernize India was indispensable. Yet perhaps the most enduring element of Nehru's legacy is not institutional but emotional. The idea of India he championed. It was an idea rooted in unity without uniformity, in strength without aggression, in ambition without arrogance. He saw India not merely as a geographical or political entity, but as a moral and civilizational space, capable of absorbing contradiction and celebrating complexity. The challenges Nehru faced have not disappeared. India continues to grapple with religious tensions, economic inequality, and questions of federal balance and national identity. The institutions he built are tested in every election, every protest, every policy debate, and yet, the fact that these institutions endure, that India remains a functioning democracy in a turbulent region, is a tribute to the groundwork laid during his years in office. Critics may fault Nehru for excessive centralization or idealism, but few deny his foundational role. He governed not with slogans or spectacle, but with seriousness and depth. He was a man of letters who took the business of statecraft seriously. His parliamentary speeches remain masterclasses in reasoned argument. His writings continue to inspire. His personal conduct, marked by dignity, humility, and discipline, set a tone for public life that still serves as a benchmark. Jawaharlal Nehru passed away in 1964, but his influence remains woven into the DNA of modern India. His vision is present in the secular clauses of the Constitution, in the independence of the judiciary, in the periodic pulse of free elections, in the innovation labs of IITs, and in the democratic aspirations of citizens from all walks of life. In the years since his passing, India has changed profoundly. It has grown more populous, more prosperous, more assertive. New challenges, climate change, digital transformation, geopolitical shifts have emerged. But the fundamental questions Nehru grappled with remain as relevant as ever. How does a diverse nation stay united? How does democracy serve the poorest? How can freedom be sustained, not just won? As India charts its path into the future, Nehru's life offers not a blueprint, but a compass. It reminds us that leadership must be rooted in values, that progress requires institutions, not just intentions, and that a truly free society must be built every day with care, courage, and conviction. More than a statesman, Nehru was a builder of national consciousness. His was a vision of an India that could rise from colonization not through mimicry of its former rulers, but through rediscovery of its own genius, scientific, cultural, spiritual, and democratic. In that sense, Nehru's India was never meant to be finished. It was always a work in progress, a journey toward justice, equality, and enlightenment. And that journey continues.